I never thought I'd be the type of person to have my entire life fall apart because of someone else's mother. But here I am, 3 months later, still trying to piece together how everything went so wrong so fast. My name is Sarah, and until recently, I thought I had it all figured out. I was engaged to Brett, the man I thought was my soulmate, planning what should have been the happiest day of my life. Instead, I'm sitting in my best friend Angela's spare bedroom, scrolling through apartment listings and wondering how a love story that felt so perfect could crumble so completely. Brett and I met in 2021 at a coffee shop downtown. I was running late for work, he was buried in his laptop, and when I accidentally bumped his table and spilled his drink everywhere, instead of getting angry, he just laughed. Within 6 months, we were practically inseparable. He was everything I thought I wanted in a partner: kind, ambitious, funny, and completely devoted to me. Or so I thought. After a year and a half together, we moved into this cute little apartment across town. It felt like we were building something real, something lasting. When Brett first brought me home to meet his parents, I was nervous but excited. His father Walt seemed pleasant enough, though he was pretty quiet throughout dinner. But his mother Susan, that was a different story entirely. From the moment I walked through their front door, I could feel her eyes analyzing every detail about me. The way I dressed, the way I spoke, even the way I held my fork. She spent the entire dinner quizzing me about my background with this weird, tight smile that never quite reached her eyes. I remember mentioning that my dad worked in construction and my mom was a teacher's aide. And watching something shift in Susan's expression, it was subtle, but I caught it. This slight souring before she quickly masked it with that fake smile again. When I brought it up to Brett later, he brushed off my concerns. He said she was just protective and old-fashioned. His exact words were that she came from a family that valued certain connections, but that he didn't care about any of that stuff. I believed him because, well, love makes you stupid sometimes. I wanted so badly for his family to accept me that I convinced myself I was just being oversensitive. When Brett proposed last year during a romantic weekend getaway at this charming little bed and breakfast upstate, I was absolutely over the moon. We talked about having a medium-sized wedding. Nothing too extravagant since we were both saving every penny for a house down payment. Everything felt perfect. Everything felt right. But the problem started. Almost immediately after we announced our engagement, Susan insisted on being involved in every single wedding detail. At first, it actually seemed helpful. She had connections with vendors and offered to help coordinate everything since I worked such long hours at my job. But it quickly became obvious that she wasn't helping me plan my wedding. She was taking it over completely. The venue I'd fallen in love with, too shabby for their family's standards. The catering company I wanted to use, not the kind of food served at their family events. The dress I had dreamed about since I was a little girl. A bit cheap looking, don't you think, dear? Brett kept saying it was easier to just go along with her suggestions than to fight her on everything. So I reluctantly agreed to compromise on some things to keep the peace. But it felt like death by 1,000 cuts. Every single decision that was taken away from me chipped away at my excitement, until wedding planning felt more like a chore than a celebration of our love. Real turning point came during what I now realize was an ambush dinner at their house. About 4 months before the wedding, Susan had invited her friends Rita and Angela over. And I realized halfway through the evening that I was basically being paraded in front of them for approval. They kept exchanging these little glances whenever I spoke, like they were communicating in some secret code I wasn't privy to. At one point, Rita asked where I summered as a child, and I actually laughed because I thought she was joking. When I explained that my family's idea of vacation was camping at the state park or visiting my grandma in Ohio, the entire table went silent. The awkwardness was so thick you could cut it with a knife. After dinner, Susan cornered me in the kitchen while I was helping clean up. She started with what seemed like casual conversation about Brett's ex-girlfriend Melissa, who apparently came from some influential family with a vacation home in the Hamptons. Then she casually mentioned how Brett had always been destined for great things and how she hoped I wouldn't hold him back. I remember feeling like I'd been physically slapped. When I asked her what exactly she meant by that, she dropped all pretense. She told me that while I seemed nice enough, I clearly wasn't from the right sort of background to help Brett's future. That my lack of refinement would eventually embarrass him in important social circles. That I wouldn't know how to entertain properly or make the right connections for his career. I was so shocked I couldn't even respond at first. When I finally found my voice and told her she was being incredibly rude, she just laughed. This cold, condescending little laugh that made my blood run cold. She said something about how my defensiveness just proved her point. She looked me dead in the eye and said, Brett deserves someone who could match his potential, not drag him down. I walked out of that kitchen immediately and told Brett we needed to leave. In the car, I was shaking as I told him everything his mother had said. I expected outrage. I expected anger on my behalf. I expected him to be as horrified as I was. Instead, he got quiet and said she didn't mean it like that she was just worried about our future. He actually asked if maybe I had misunderstood her tone. That night was our first major fight. I couldn't believe he was defending her behavior instead of standing up for me. He eventually admitted that his mother had been expressing concerns about our compatibility for months, apparently. She'd been filling his head with doubts about whether I would fit into the future he imagined for himself. The worst part, he was actually listening to her over the next 2 weeks. Everything deteriorated rapidly. Brett became distant and started staying late at work. When he was home, he'd bring up random concerns about our relationship that had never existed before. Like whether our different backgrounds would cause problems with raising kids, or if I'd be comfortable at his company events. It all came to a devastating head when Susan invited us over for another dinner, supposedly to clear the air. Brett practically begged me to go, saying she wanted to apologize and make things right, like an absolute idiot. I believed him and agreed to go. There was no apology. Instead, Susan spent the entire evening making backhanded comments about everything from my clothes to my table manners to even the way I spoke. When Brett stepped outside to take a phone call, she leaned across the table with this chilling certainty and delivered the words that still echo in my head. "You're nothing without my son," she said with ice in her voice. "He can do so much better than you, and you should walk away before you ruin his life with your ordinariness." When I started crying, she actually rolled her eyes and said my emotional behavior just proved her point about my lack of composure. When Brett returned, I was already gathering my things to leave. When he asked what happened, Susan put on this concerned, innocent face and said I had overreacted to some gentle advice about wedding planning. I was done. Completely and utterly done. In the car, I told Brett exactly what had happened and gave him an ultimatum. Either we cut contact with his mother until she could learn to respect me, or the wedding was off. I expected him to finally stand up for me. I expected him to choose the woman he claimed to love over his toxic mother. He did in single quotes instead. He said maybe his mother was right, maybe we were rushing into things, maybe we did come from 2 different worlds that would make it impossible to work. The man I loved, who had sworn he didn't care about status or background, was suddenly parroting his mother's classist nonsense. I took off my engagement ring right there in the car and placed it on the dashboard. I told him to drop me at Angela's place instead of our apartment. He didn't even try to stop me when I got out of the car. The next day, while Brett was at work, I packed most of my things from our apartment. I left my key and a note saying I would arrange to get the rest of my stuff later. I blocked Susan's number immediately, though I kept Brett unblocked in case he came to his senses. He texted a few days later with a pathetic message about how he was confused and needed time to think. I replied that there was nothing to think about. Either he was willing to build a life with me based on love and respect, or he wasn't. His response? That maybe we should take a break until after his big work project was finished, then reassess everything. That was my answer. 3 years together, and he couldn't even properly break up with me. He just wanted to keep me hanging on while he reassessed whether I was good enough for his precious family's standards. I told him not to contact me again. According to our mutual friends, Brett has been telling people we mutually decided to call off the wedding due to different life goals. Even in the end, he couldn't be honest about what really happened. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn that I never saw coming. About 2 weeks ago, I started getting phone calls from an unknown number. When I finally answered, thinking it might be work-related, I heard Susan's voice on the other end. But this wasn't the cold, composed woman who had torn me apart in her kitchen. This was someone desperate and broken. She was sobbing. Actually sobbing into the phone, begging me to take Brett back. Apparently, my absence from Brett's life has had some interesting consequences that nobody anticipated. Sometimes the people who destroy your life end up begging you to save theirs. And sometimes, watching their perfect world crumble becomes the most unexpected form of justice you never asked for. Meanwhile, I've thrown myself completely into rebuilding my life from the ground up. Yesterday, I got a voicemail from Susan, and I honestly have no idea how she managed to get my new number. Her voice was different this time, softer and broken. She was sniffling and asking if we could talk about Brett. I didn't even listen to the whole thing before hitting delete. Whatever drama is unfolding in their perfect little world isn't my problem anymore. I know this story has been long, but I needed to get it all off my chest. The wedding would have been next weekend. Instead of walking down the aisle in some overpriced dress Susan picked out, I'm taking myself on a solo trip to a beach rental I found online. It's not the honeymoon I once imagined, but maybe it's exactly the fresh start I need. The first month after the breakup was honestly a complete blur of pain and confusion. I stayed on Angela's pull-out couch way longer than I had planned to, and she was literally a saint about it. Every single morning, I'd wake up disoriented, reaching across the bed for Brett before the crushing reality hit me all over again. My appetite completely disappeared, and I lost 10 pounds without even trying. Angela started leaving protein bars on the coffee table because I'd forget to eat for entire days. I spent countless hours just staring at apartment listings on my laptop without actually calling anyone. Something about making that move felt so final, like admitting that this nightmare was really my new reality. Angela never pressured me, but after about 3 weeks, she gently suggested we go look at a place that had just opened up in her friend's building. The apartment was nothing special, just a small one-bedroom with a kitchen barely big enough to turn around in, but it was within my budget and only a 15-minute drive from work. I signed the lease the same day, surprising myself with how quickly I made the decision once I was there. Moving in was another emotional hurdle I wasn't prepared for. I'd left most of my furniture behind at Brett's place because I couldn't deal with arranging movers while feeling like an emotional wreck. Angela and her boyfriend helped me pick up the essentials from a furniture store. A bed, a small couch, a dining table that doubles as my desk. The apartment stayed pretty sparse for weeks because I just couldn't muster the energy to make it feel like home. Work became my lifeline during those dark early days. I'd arrive early, leave late, and volunteer for extra projects just to avoid sitting alone in my empty apartment with my thoughts spiraling. My team lead noticed my dedication and started giving me more responsibilities, coordinating with other departments, training the new hire, that kind of thing. It felt good to be needed, to be valued for something other than whether I could make the right social connections. About 2 months after the breakup, I had an unexpected encounter that gave me some insight into what was happening on the other side. I ran into Nick, Brett's younger brother, at the grocery store. I almost hid behind the cereal display when I spotted him, but he saw me first. I was surprised when he actually approached me, looking genuinely uncomfortable. He told me he was sorry about what happened and that he'd actually argued with his mom about how she treated me. It was awkward but weirdly validating to hear someone from Brett's family acknowledge that I'd been wronged. That's when I first heard that things weren't going great for Brett either. I thanked Nick for the apology but kept the conversation brief. I wasn't ready to be pulled back into that world, even peripherally. A week later, my old college roommate invited me to a party. I almost didn't go, but Angela practically pushed me out the door, insisting that I needed to remember how to be a person again. She was right, though I'd never admit it to her face. The party was where I met Matt. He was the roommate's cousin, visiting from out of town. We just ended up in the same conversation circle, talking about random things like favorite movies and travel disasters. He asked for my number at the end of the night, and I surprised myself by giving it to him. Our first date was coffee on a Sunday afternoon. Low pressure, casual. He was easy to talk to, and for the first time in months, I went hours without thinking about Brett. Matt works in something completely different from Brett's field, lives in a modest apartment similar to mine, and has a refreshingly normal family that doesn't seem to care about summer homes or making the right social connections. When I told him about my breakup, the condensed version anyway, he just listened without trying to fix anything or offer empty platitudes. It was exactly what I needed. Around month 3 post-breakup, an unexpected opportunity came up at work. My company was restructuring, creating a new team, and they needed someone to take on more responsibility. My extra efforts over the previous months had apparently not gone unnoticed. My manager encouraged me to apply, though she warned me the position would involve longer hours and more stress. I almost didn't go for it. My confidence was still pretty shaky, but I figured I had nothing to lose. The interview process was grueling. 3 rounds with various department heads, a presentation I stayed up until 2 in the morning perfecting, and a final meeting with upper management. I honestly didn't think I'd get it. There were other candidates with more experience and better credentials. But 2 weeks later, my manager called me into her office to offer me the position. The promotion came with a significant raise that meant I could finally stop stressing about making rent each month. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was enough to start rebuilding my emergency fund, which had been completely depleted during the post-breakup chaos. I was still processing this good news when I had another strange encounter. I bumped into Rita, Susan's gossipy friend, at the mall. I was shopping for professional clothes for my new role when she spotted me coming out of a store. She acted overly friendly, as if we'd been close before, which was definitely not the case. After some awkward small talk, she dropped what felt like carefully planned information. Brett had lost his job. Apparently, the big project he'd been working on, the one he'd used as an excuse when asking for a break from our relationship, had fallen apart spectacularly. Something about missed deadlines and poor management decisions. Rita seemed to be watching my reaction closely, so I kept my face neutral while she continued sharing details. Brett had been let go, and according to Rita, he'd been struggling to find his footing ever since. She also mentioned, with poorly disguised glee, that Melissa had briefly rekindled things with Brett after our breakup, only to end it again after just a few weeks. Rita suggested that perhaps I'd dodged a bullet and actually winked at me. Later that week, I had another strange encounter that left me even more unsettled. I was having dinner with Matt at this new restaurant downtown when I spotted Susan across the room. She was with Walt and another couple I didn't recognize. Our eyes met briefly, and I quickly looked away, my heart suddenly racing. I expected her to ignore me or maybe give me one of her famous cold stares. Instead, she actually approached our table while Walt looked on with an expression of mild horror. She greeted me like we were old friends, commenting on how wonderful I looked. She asked about my new job, which made me wonder how she even knew about that, and complimented my outfit. Matt looked confused but remained polite as I awkwardly introduced him. Susan's smile tightened almost imperceptibly when she realized I was on a date, but she maintained her friendly facade. Before leaving, she mentioned that everyone misses me and that she hoped we could catch up properly someday. The weirdness continued. About a week later, when Angela forwarded me a message she'd received from Brett asking how I was doing and if I was seeing anyone, she hadn't responded, knowing I wouldn't want her to share details of my life with him through mutual friends. I learned more about Brett's current situation. After losing his job, he'd apparently moved back in with his parents while job hunting. The perfect life Susan had envisioned for him was crumbling, and from what I heard, she was not handling it well at all. My relationship with Matt was progressing naturally. No rush, just genuine connection. We'd been seeing each other for about 2 months, taking things slow. He came over to my apartment regularly, helping me slowly make the space feel more like home. We installed shelves for my books one weekend and hung some artwork the next. Small touches that made the place feel less temporary. Then last Friday, everything shifted again in a way I never could have predicted. I was leaving work when my phone buzzed with a notification. A voicemail from an unknown number. I almost deleted it without listening, probably just another spam call, but something made me play it. It was Susan. Her voice was thick with what sounded like genuine tears. She said she'd been trying to reach me, that she needed to talk to me about Brett, that he wasn't doing well, that she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd do anything to fix things between us. 6 months ago, this woman told me I was nothing without her son. Now, she was practically begging for my help. After debating for 3 days about whether to respond, I finally decided to text Brett's number with a simple message asking what was going on. Within 5 minutes, literally 5 minutes, my phone rang. It was Susan, not Brett. Apparently, she's been using his phone to contact me since I had blocked her number. The Susan on the phone was nothing like the cold, judgmental woman I remembered. Her voice was shaky, almost desperate. As she begged me to save the son she once said I wasn't good enough for. Sometimes the people who once told you that you weren't good enough end up desperately begging you to save their broken lives. And sometimes, watching their perfect world crumble becomes the most twisted form of justice you never asked for. The conversation with Susan was still creepy and uncomfortable, but then she launched into what I can only describe as the most awkward apology I've ever received in my entire life. She admitted that she'd been terrible to me, that she'd misjudged me based on superficial factors, and that she deeply regretted driving me away from her son. I sat there in stunned silence, my coffee growing cold in my hands, as she continued explaining that Brett had been completely lost since our breakup. According to Susan, he'd spiraled dramatically after losing his job. He was drinking too much, staying out late, and making terrible financial decisions that were destroying his future. When I finally managed to ask why she was telling me all this personal information, her answer made my skin absolutely crawl. She thought I could help Brett recover because I was such a stabilizing influence on him. She actually said that Brett needs someone responsible, like me right now, to get his life back on track. The sheer audacity of this woman was breathtaking. To go from telling me I wasn't good enough for her precious son to deciding I was exactly what he needed when things got tough was beyond hypocritical. I told her as calmly as I could manage that I was sorry Brett was struggling, but that we'd been over 4 months now. I mentioned that I was seeing someone else, hoping that would end the conversation. Her response was a dismissive comment about how these rebound relationships rarely last and how Brett and I had real history together. Then she asked if we could meet for coffee to discuss the situation further. Against my better judgment and Matt's very concerned look when I told him about it later, I agreed to meet Susan at a coffee shop the following weekend. I told myself it would give me closure. Maybe I also wanted to see for myself how desperate things had gotten for her to come crawling back to the girl she once considered beneath her son. When I arrived at the coffee shop, Susan was already there, looking noticeably different from the polished, superior woman I remembered from family dinners. Her normally perfect hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail. Her makeup was minimal, and she looked genuinely tired. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. She'd already ordered me my favorite drink, a detail that was both thoughtful and deeply unsettling because it meant Brett had told her what I liked. The next hour was absolutely surreal. Susan laid out Brett's complete downfall in excruciating detail, like she was presenting evidence in a court case. After losing his job, he'd tried to maintain his expensive lifestyle while job hunting, quickly depleting his savings account. He'd made a terrible investment in some friend startup that went absolutely nowhere. He'd maxed out 2 credit cards buying things he couldn't afford. And now he was living in his old childhood bedroom at their house, sleeping until noon and barely applying for jobs. Throughout her entire monologue, I kept waiting for her to ask me directly to take Brett back. Instead, she did something far more manipulative. She kept saying things like he was at his absolute best when he was with you and you were always so good at motivating him to be better, and he listens to you in a way he never listens to me or his father. When I reminded her that she once thought I wasn't good enough for her son, she actually teared up and said that she'd been protecting her son from the wrong things, and that she should have valued my steadiness more than Melissa's social connections. I almost laughed out loud at how transparent she was being. Suddenly, I was steady rather than boring, responsible rather than lacking ambition. The same qualities she'd once criticized were now exactly what her son needed. I left that meeting feeling oddly hollow inside. I'd expected satisfaction, seeing Susan brought low, but mostly I felt pity mixed with lingering anger. I told her I'd think about talking to Brett, but made absolutely no promises. That should have been the end of it. It absolutely WASN single quotes. The calls started the very next day. Susan called to follow up on our coffee meeting. Then she called again to tell me Brett had asked about me. Then she called to mention a job opening she thought Brett might be qualified for, wondering if my company was hiring. Every single day, I started letting the calls go to voicemail. The messages got increasingly desperate and unhinged. She mentioned that Brett's father was threatening to cut him off financially if he didn't get his act together soon. She talked about how their family friends were asking uncomfortable questions about Brett's situation at social gatherings. She even brought up my parents once, saying she'd love to make amends with them too, as if we were all going to be one big happy family again. Nick, Brett's younger brother, texted me one evening to apologize for his mother's increasingly erratic behavior. He explained that Brett's spiral had been much worse than the family had initially let on. Apparently, Brett had started drinking heavily after our breakup, which contributed significantly to his poor performance at work. Nick mentioned that Susan was partly blaming herself for pushing me away, seeing it as the start of Brett's decline. But he was quick to add that Brett was responsible for his own choices and that I shouldn't feel guilted into getting involved. I appreciated Nick's honesty and the fact that someone in that family recognized I wasn't responsible for fixing Brett's mess. Meanwhile, things with Matt were getting more serious and stable. He'd been incredibly understanding about the whole bizarre situation, never pressuring me one way or another about how to handle it. We'd started talking about possibly moving in together when his lease ended in a few months. The contrast between his calm, supportive presence and the chaos of Brett's family wasn't lost on me. About 2 weeks after our coffee meeting, Susan escalated her campaign to a level that crossed every possible boundary. I was walking to my car after work when I spotted her waiting in the parking lot like some kind of stalker. My heart dropped into my stomach. This was crossing a major line that should never be crossed. She approached me with this frantic, desperate energy, clutching a folder that apparently contained Brett's resume and asking if I could put in a good word for him at my company. I was absolutely livid. I told her firmly that her behavior was completely inappropriate and that she needed to stop contacting me immediately. Her face crumpled like a child's, and she started crying right there in the parking lot, saying she didn't know what else to do, that Brett wasn't listening to her, though she was desperate to help her son. A few of my coworkers witnessed this uncomfortable scene. which was mortifying beyond words. I ended up guiding Susan to a bench away from the main entrance and telling her as calmly as I could manage that I couldn't help her or Brett, that our relationship was over and that she needed to respect my boundaries. She left eventually, but the damage was done. For the rest of the week, I got curious looks from coworkers who had seen the parking lot scene. Angela, who also works at my company, fielded questions from people wanting to know who the crying woman was. It was embarrassing and infuriating to have my personal drama spill into my professional life. Then Brett himself finally reached out directly. He sent a long text message apologizing for his mother's behavior and for how things had ended between us. He admitted he'd made a huge mistake listening to his mother instead of standing up for our relationship. He said he missed me every day and had been too ashamed to contact me directly after everything that happened. Reading his message, I felt absolutely nothing. No flutter of lingering feelings, no satisfaction at his regret, just tiredness and a vague sense of closure. I showed the message to Matt, who read it without comment, respecting my need to process it myself. I decided not to respond to Brett right away. I needed time to think about what, if anything, I wanted to say. But Susan didn't give me that time to think. She called again the next morning, asking if I'd received Brett's message and what I thought about it. When I told her I thought it was inappropriate for her to be involving herself in our communication, she got defensive and said she was just trying to help her son. That was when something inside me finally snapped. I told Susan in a voice so calm it surprised even me that I was blocking her number after this call. That if she contacted me at work again, I would report it as harassment. And that Brett was an adult who needed to solve his own problems instead of sending his mother to fix them. Before hanging up, I added one final thought that perhaps if she'd raised her son to value people for their character rather than their social standing, he wouldn't be in this situation now. That evening, I finally responded to Brett's text. I told him I forgave him for how things ended because holding on to anger wasn't helping either of us. But I also made it crystal clear that we had no future together, that I had moved on completely, and that he needed to do the same. I suggested he get professional help for his drinking and financial problems and that he needed to stop letting his mother fight his battles. I ended by wishing him well and asking him not to contact me again. I blocked both their numbers immediately after sending that message. It felt like closing a door that had been left ajar for far too long. The next day, though, I got an Instagram direct message from Susan. She'd created a brand new account just to message me. This time her tone was angry and accusatory. She accused me of being heartless, of abandoning Brett when he needed me most. She said I was throwing away years of history out of pride. That last bit almost made me laugh out loud. Susan talking about pride as if she hadn't destroyed our relationship with her own arrogance. I didn't respond. Just blocked that account too. But she found other ways to contact me. Emails from new addresses. Even a handwritten letter mailed to my apartment. Each contact was more desperate than the last, more unhinged and inappropriate. The final straw came last weekend. Matt and I were having a quiet dinner at my apartment when there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find Brett standing there, looking disheveled and clearly having had a few drinks. Susan was hovering anxiously behind him like a helicopter parent. I was so shocked I couldn't speak at first. Matt came up behind me, asking who was at the door, and the look on Brett's face when he realized I had someone else there was almost pitiful. What followed was awkward and uncomfortable beyond description. Brett tried to talk about our past, about how much he regretted his choices. Susan kept interjecting with comments about how good we were together, how we belonged together. I didn't invite them in. Instead, I stepped into the hallway and closed the door partially behind me. I told Brett as gently but firmly as I could that this wasn't appropriate. That showing up unannounced at my home crossed a serious boundary, and that I had meant what I said in my message about moving on. Brett's response surprised me. He turned to his mother and said this was exactly why he hadn't wanted to come, that he'd told her this would only make things worse. Then he apologized to me again, not for the breakup this time, but for not protecting me from his mother back then and now. I haven't heard from either of them in the 5 days since that encounter. Nick texted once to apologize again and let me know he was taking Brett to his first Gamblers Anonymous meeting. I thanked him but didn't ask for further updates. Matt and I are going away for a weekend trip soon. I've changed my email address and asked my manager to be on the lookout for unwanted visitors. Life goes on, and surprisingly, it's better than I could have imagined a year ago when I was planning a wedding to the wrong person.